Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm quite excited to be doing today's episode, which is on judgers versus perceivers, and it's one of the things I found during my experiment. I suppose one thing that could be said about judgers versus perceivers is their relationship with the external world, since the J's in MBTI have extroverted judging and introverted perceiving. It's different in socionics, but in MBTI, that's how it is. And the perceivers have extroverted perceiving and introverted judging as their strongest two functions. This makes it a fundamental difference how they interact externally in the world versus how they interact internally. So basically, today's video is about the external and internal worlds. Now, Carl Jung talked a bit about this, but it was mostly along the extroverted and introverted dichotomy. He basically said that extroverts have a more easy time interacting with the world, whereas introverts are basically stuck interacting with their own environment. And while this is kind of true, today I wanted to bring our focus to another topic, which is how we interact with the external world. And I would argue that for judgers, it's quite similar, as well as for all the perceivers, we're quite similar. So there's two questions in the experiment that I found to be quite pertinent, and one of them is once again the trolley problem. So I explained this in another video of mine that you can watch. And the second problem is not really a problem, more like a question. I basically asked people what their favorite movies were and why, and recorded how they answered that question. So I'll talk about the trolley problem first. It's important to note that in my iteration of the problem, I asked people, is it more ethical to pull the lever or do nothing, and why? And would you pull the lever or do nothing, and why? So for my volunteers who were physically present when I did the experiments, we were asking them the questions, so their results kind of got messed up. But for my clients who read the questions off of a text and record their own video and then send those to me, they would read this as one single question, even though the question was a two-parter. Now, this is very important because, as it turns out, the higher your extroverted judging, so the EJs particularly, the more likely you were to omit the first question, what is more ethical? Almost none of the perceivers skip the first question, and if your extroverted judging is a little bit lower, like if you're an IJ, you were also kind of likely to skip the first question, but not as likely as the EJs. So this got me thinking that I guess asking someone what is more ethical, that requires an internal judgment, whether that be TI or FI. You have to have the internal structure required to answer a question like that and to focus on it. I mean, I'm sure even an ENTJ, they do have internal structure, they do have FI, and the ENFJs and ESFJs do have TI, but since it's repressed, they don't actually focus on it that much, thus they omit the question. Meanwhile, the IPs, those with the strongest introverted judging, they lead with either TI or FI. These people painstakingly usually answered the ethical component. Now, what I think is really interesting about the IPs is that they answered the first part of the question on what's more ethical, and sometimes they answer the second part of the question in a way that's not really congruent with the first part. So they might say, it's more ethical to pull the lever, but I wouldn't pull the lever because blah, blah, blah. I think it's interesting that I was a person who, I mean, it's obviously a famous question, but I was a person who wrote it down as like a two-parter. I believe it's because I am an IP. For me, those two questions are intensely different. So it makes sense for me to ask what's more ethical and then ask about their personal action. So I wasn't trying to test for anything by asking a two-parter. It just came naturally to me to ask a question like that. So I was actually really surprised when I saw all these people skipping the first part of the question, and I realized that it's probably because they imply the answer to the first part in the second part. They would immediately say, well, I would pull the lever, and that answer implies that they think it's more ethical to pull the lever. So my point is that it seems like the judgers, they prioritize their action out into the external world. that's what they focus most of their energy on. They focus a little bit of energy on structuring their internal environment, maybe deciphering what's more ethical to them, but that's almost like an afterthought, especially for the EJs with inferior introverted judging. With extroverted judging, you're aggressively and actively structuring the external environment, and through action, you imply your internal world almost. They live mostly through their actions in the external world. It seems like the perceivers with introverted judging, they're more likely to come up with a nuanced explanation of what they think is more ethical and then move on to what they would do. And interestingly, some perceivers even skipped the part about what they would do. I assume it's because what they would do was the same as what they thought was ethical, so they omitted the second part. So it's interesting how the perceivers are more likely to skip the second part while the judges are more likely to skip the first part, although most perceivers answered both parts of the question. Also, this fits into an idea I read from Michael Pierce. I'm not sure if he came up with this idea, but he was the first person I heard about talking about it. So it's this idea that judges are active towards the external world and passive towards the internal world, whereas perceivers are the opposite. They're passive when it comes to the external world and active when it comes to the internal world. So judging is structuring, it's evaluative, so it's deciding what's good and bad or what's logical or illogical, and it's taking that and doing stuff with that, with the evaluation. So it's going out and changing. So if you have extroverted judging, that's your attitude towards the external world. You want to change it and morph it according to your evaluations. Each decision isn't just in a bubble by itself. It has to be acted upon and exacted. Meanwhile, perception is passive and observational and maybe even a bit adaptive. You're just taking in information, you're exploring, and that is the attitude of people with high extrovert judging internally. So I imagine them as reacting to their inner impulses, reacting to their inner feelings, or maybe even inner thoughts. In contrast, the perceivers with higher introverted judging, that active, energetic attitude is orientated internally, so they are trying to structure all of these things inside, trying to change themselves, trying to dictate how their feelings and thoughts go. They say that FI is the idealist, but I think it's both FI and TI in a way. And since they're constantly arranging their internal environment, I feel like it's easier to pull out, oh yeah, based on my judgment, this is more ethical. Meanwhile, their relationship to the external world is more, the world is what it is, observational, accepting, adapting. Alright, so now let's move on to the second question. What's your favorite movie and why? It sounds like such an innocent question, but I found so many interesting things from it. And this, unlike the trolley question, which I just asked to get people thinking, I wasn't expecting to find anything from that question. But for this movie question, I had a few predictions as to how people would answer it. I thought that I didn't know who would do this actually. I thought some people would answer mostly based on how they relate, how they themselves see the movie, how they relate to the characters, how the movie affected them and impacted them, how it changed their life, etc. Meanwhile, some other people would mostly focus on the movie itself, say that it's good, just a baseline judgment that it's good. It has good acting, it has good cinematography, it has a good plot or an interesting plot, or the plot had a lot of twists. Just make a bunch of external statements about the movie. And it turns out this was also mostly related to extroverted judging versus extroverted perceiving. For the perceivers who have higher introverted judging, I think they're more interested in their internal world to begin with. So when they're answering a question about personal preference, their interaction with it is key. The FI people always say that they liked a character because they could relate to it, or they're similar in some way, or the movie made them cry. I know now you're wondering, well, what about TI? TI is probably not going to be talking that much about emotions. And TI is maybe not going to be that keen about answering questions based on personal preference, which is by nature kind of an emotional thing. So I was also curious, and it turns out that they would say more objective statements like, I could watch this movie 10 times, or it's the only movie that I could watch more than once, or I watch this movie every year during Christmas. So that is an objective statement that can be externally verified. However, interestingly, the subject is still involved, right? They are still involved. The TI user themselves are still involved in this judgment. They're using some sort of external thing to substantiate their preference, which strikes me as a very TI thing to do, but the subject is still involved. Meanwhile, in contrast, the judgers, they tend to say more, well, especially the EJs, right? The EJs tend to stop at the object level. The subject, I guess, introverted judging being repressed is less interesting, or maybe not interesting at all, or maybe they don't see it as a valid answer. Or I keep their answer objective, so they say that the movie has many famous actors who did a great job. The costumes were beautiful. The plot was very unexpected. They don't talk about themselves, the subject, even though the question is technically about themselves, right? It's which movie do you like, but they don't talk about the you, they don't talk about themselves. And unsurprisingly, this tendency depends on the position of your function. So the IJs with introverted judging and extroverted judging in the middle, they're likely to mention both factors, both how the movie actually is and how they relate it to the movie or their interactions with the movie. And EPs are kind of the same. Meanwhile, IPs are the most likely to just delve into the subject, just talk about them. And EJs were by far the most likely to only talk about the movie and not about their personal responses. Alright, that is all for today. Stay tuned to watch more videos on my experimental findings. I'm really excited to get them all out for you guys. Subscribe to this channel if you like my content and consider pledging your support on Patreon. For those of you who are confused about your personality type, I hope this helps you determine that. But if not, if you're still confused, I do offer a typing service on my website, kindof8.com. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.